Add our normal map. And now we have this kind of running whip stitch along that seam. Looks great. We can see it a little bit better if we drop the color. Awesome. Exactly what I would expect from a shirt like this. In most cases, though, you're not going to see that because it is actually many, many, many stitches more than this. And they do a good job of kind of tucking this over the top. But it just looks nice, right? Like it kind of brings the garment together a little bit better. And you don't have to do it everywhere, right? Like if you know that on a realistic garment, this stitching would not be here, you don't have to do it at all. There are other areas where you will absolutely see it, right? Like over here, we're definitely going to see the stitching around the neck, and it'll probably be like kind of a double stitch, which is there on purpose. So not having it here would be just fine. You could still get that detail somewhere else. But you can also do it, and it kind of embellishes it a little bit. We get to make these choices and decide what kind of details our garments are going to have, right? So now I'll go ahead and just add some stitching to some other parts of the shirt. And there we go. We have our stitches set up in Maya. We're ready to set them up in Toolbag. All right, here we have the shirt. And I've baked a couple of maps here. I've baked a normal map. I've baked an ambient occlusion. I've set up the shader to have some volumetric scattering and tiling normal map. Just so it looks a little bit nicer than just like a basic shirt with no textures. So let's go ahead and set up our stitching material. So I have my stitching example default that has been created with the import of the FBX. First thing I'm going to do is go down here to my transparency settings here and choose cutout. Once that's loaded, we can go ahead and select our alpha map. In this case, we want the stitching opacity. And I'm going to change the channel from alpha to red, just because this is a white and black texture. And now we can adjust the threshold depending on our viewing angle. So the further out your camera is, kind of the lower you'll want your threshold to be. Some game engines will actually alter the threshold based on camera distance, which is kind of nice. So it will actually thicken out as you zoom out. In this case, Toolbag's not going to do that for us, but that's okay. We can kind of set the level we want for our renders. Now, let's go ahead and set up our normal map as well. Pretty easy. We have control over the colors, so let's say in most cases you're going to want your stitching to be fairly similar to the color of whatever the garment is, but occasionally you'll have stitching like on leather or denim where you specifically choose more of like, it's usually like kind of a gold stitch, something like this. But I like to set up the stitching so that it is noticeable and has a little bit of contrast with the garment. So I'll set it to like kind of a mid gray. So we can kind of see them a little bit here. This is pretty intense, but let's just say that we like this for demo demo purposes. I'm going to increase the roughness. You can set up volumetric scattering on this if you want to. I'm not going to. I'm just going to set the diffusion type to microfiber. And that's going to get it reading a little bit closer, in this case, to the highlight of this shirt, which is also using microfiber, or the fuzz component. If your stitches, you may not want your stitches to do that if they're like catgut stitches. Not typically used anymore, but if you're doing a historical piece that would use that, you probably want to keep it as GGX. But it can get a really nice breakup if you have like a leather base and then the microfiber stitching. You can get some really nice contrast there. I'm also going to go down to occlusion here, turn on occlusion, and I'm going to grab the occlusion texture I've created here. Just adds a little bit of darkening around the edges of each stitch, which is kind of nice. It's fairly subtle. You can overdrive it if you want to, though it is not necessary to do so. Just adds a little bit of extra pop to them. And that's pretty much it. So we have full control over now the albedo and roughness values without having to go back into our texture editor. Now, what we can also do under texture here is we can set up tiling here, but we don't want to tile in the V direction, because if we do that, we start to lose whatever tile we've chosen, right? It is kind of nice if you want to, like, say, okay, I actually want to change the type of stitch. And if you've set it up in such a way that, you know, you've made sure that there's not a lot of overlap. I tried to make sure that this map has consistent distance between the stitching types, but that it's kind of difficult to control. But we can go ahead and tile more in the U direction if we want to make the stitches smaller or larger, which is kind of nice. If you're going to be using Unreal or something like that, making a custom shader for this is a great way to go. That way you can give your artists on your team more control over this. You could have it control things like the thickness of the stitching and stuff like that. If you use a second UV set, you could actually include like the groove that runs underneath the stitching as well in the normal map. And then that's just going to give you an extra level of detail. But yeah, that is how you set up your stitching. Get it working on your garment. UV shell here, and same here. I do want a little bit here on the inside of the elastic because I want to create a sort of cap here where when the character raises their arm, we're not going to see into the back faces of the garment. We're going to see instead something more like this. Let's go ahead and do that on the other side as well. I'll grab this internal edge loop here, extrude, and merge to center. I'll convert this selection to faces, and then to UVs, then go to mapping, normal base, just to get some UVs on this. We're going to rescale these, place them on the sheet in a minute here. For now, I'm going to put them outside of the 0 to 1 space. Now let's go ahead and fix the sleeves here. We want our UV seam to be on this edge rather than on the exterior edge. So I'll just go ahead and cut that. And then we need to make sure that it aligns nicely with the high poly. So I'll go ahead and make that a live mesh. And go ahead and scale this up so that it sits nicely on the mesh. Same thing here. Great. Okay. Next, what I'm going to do is move these over into a different UV space just so that I can work on it without affecting anything else. And I'm going to go ahead and sew this edge here, move it so. You can see that the border between the two islands is currently flipped or doesn't have enough mapping space. If we look at the checker, you can see it doesn't really give us a hint at this, but it is actually completely flat. So what we can go ahead and do here is select the border edges, convert that to UV, then select the internal faces and unfold. But we have some mirroring going on here, so I'm just going to move the mirrored portion over an island. And let's try that again. Unfold. Great. And we just need to fix this one here. There we go. And if we move this back, the general sort of layout of this really hasn't changed all that much. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to have something there so that when we, by happenstance, see some of this part of the edge of the sleeve, it's not just going to have no texture on it at all or look really strange. Great. So let's go ahead and move this back, and we'll do the same thing on this other sleeve. Cut down the middle, sew this line, move the interior faces away, grab the border edge, unfold the interior portions, and then fix these areas here where it's kind of triangulating, and then move the flip faces back. And there we go, we have this interior section UV to the same as the exterior section so that when we bake this normal map, this area and this area are going to have the exact same textures. So now we need to do the same thing with this part of the texture. I already know that I want this section here to be its own unique island, so I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Because this is entirely visible to the player all the time, or the viewer, in this case for a portfolio piece, we don't want this to be mirrored, we actually want this to have its own space. So let's go ahead and flip it, and I'll just go ahead and optimize it, and then straighten the UVs. Not bad. You can see that it's flattening this top edge. So I'll go ahead and unfold that. It's a little bit better. And I need to do the same here. Oh dear. We need to sew in this edge. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll move and sew. Great. Okay. Now we can unfold that. And let's grab the border edge and unfold the interior like we did before. And then just fix these little strays. Great. And I'll fix this area up. And there we go, that has its own uniquely unwrapped area here. Now I want the same thing for a portion of this part of the interior. These faces are kind of folding out and visible as well, so I'm going to go ahead and cut that section out as well. Just because we don't want to waste any of our texture sheet on areas that we're not going to see. Go ahead and cut that. And I'll move these portions outside of the 0 to 1 space and flip them. It's already looking pretty good. And I'll do the same thing I did before, selecting the outside and unfolding the interior. All right, and then for these sections, I want to have entirely just mirrored. Now the next thing we need to do is make sure that our newly created interior faces actually snap to our high poly. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, with that done, we have our nice matching UVs. We just need to go ahead and fix up some of this topology here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to go ahead and go with multi-cut, trace out some lines here to try to better support this fold, just like we did on the t-shirt. There we go, it's looking a little bit better. Maintaining this fold just a little bit nicer. Really, we could probably stand to go up another subdivision here, but it's not too bad. I'm gonna remove that. There we go. Okay, let's do the other side as well. Going in, following that sort of anisotropic highlight that we can see here, following it up with the supporting edge. There we go. That's looking a little bit better. All right, and with that, we can go ahead and finalize our UVs here. I'm going to go ahead and put the hood on a totally separate UV set. And the reason for that, or material, I should say, and the reason for that is that occasionally you might want to have the hood up or down and have two separate models for that. And rather than having the exact same textures, you're probably going to want to rebake because your folds are going to be different. So rather than having the textures for both the hood up and the hood down at the same time, in this sheet, reducing our overall textile resolution for the entire jacket, I'm going to split that into a separate sheet, and I would have the hood up and the hood down in the same sheet together. That way we just have a little bit more room for some of these extra pieces here. Let's go ahead and move these into here. And I'm just going to kind of hide these caps here in the negative space created by the sleeves. And there we go, we have thickness. We don't really have to worry about these armholes because if there's a body in there, we're not going to be able to see that. But we do have all the faces we need on the interior to be able to do some sort of havoc simulation so that when the the coat moves up, we're not going to be seeing sort of empty space here. The next thing I'm going to do that I would typically do on a game mesh, go ahead and select all these internal faces that aren't connected to a specific baking region. Switch to vertex mode. Shrink the selection down twice. Average the vertices, and then just kind of shrink them in a little bit until nothing is clipping through. You can see I had a couple here that are kind of clipping through. Just going to push those in just a bit. All right, that is great. Now let's go ahead and do a bake test on this. Before I do that, this UV layout is pretty good. We do have a little bit of empty space here. Not a big deal. It's more important that our tiling normals look good and that we have everything rotated the correct direction than it is to really fill the entire UV space. I could probably do a little bit more Tetris here to try to get a better result, but I'm going to be happy with this for now. This is totally fine. What I am going to do is go to select back facing, and I need to be in selection mode here, UV selection mode, and go to select back facing. And then I'm going to move all of the back facing shells over to a separate. You can see I've got a bit of an issue here in that some of these appear to be connected. So I'm just going to move them manually. That happens sometimes. Not a big deal. Let's go ahead and just sort of go around the mesh and make sure that, aha, okay. So we can see there is an issue here. We need to unfold these, and here as well, where we're getting this red border. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. I'll go sort of island by island. Select the edge perimeter, convert to UVs, and invert my selection. And go ahead and unfold, and then select these that are still sort of on top of each other, and unfold those individually. And I'll do the same here. Select all of these faces. Go to edges, edge perimeter, convert to UVs. Deselect the islands I don't want to touch. Invert my selection, unfold, and then just unfold these edges here. Perfect. I'll do the same thing. This one. Go faces to edge perimeter, to UVs, invert my selection. Sometimes you might have to move an island into its own space just so that you can select everything you need to without selecting some of the other shells. What I'm really trying to do here is make sure that the border edges are maintained so that when I go ahead and overlay these back onto each other, the border edges are the same. The internal stuff I don't really care quite as much about, but I want to make sure that these border edges match up so that when this normal map bakes, and with all my texturing, that the textures actually line up properly there. All right, let's take a look, see if we still have any remaining inverted faces. Along that edge seems pretty good. Great. All right. And if we go ahead and overlay these back onto each other, you can see they still look correct. There is a little bit of strangeness going on here that I'm not happy with. I'm kind of curious how that will bake, so I'm just going to leave it for now. We'll take a look at it. So let's go ahead and, with all of our inverted faces, move out of the 0 to 1 space. Let's go ahead and get a test bake on there and see what it looks like. All right, here I have an old test bake. You can see that my normals are completely incorrect because my UVs have changed. But I do have my high poly and my low poly slotted into my bake group. So let's go ahead and set up the baking location and bake a normal map. Nice. That's looking pretty good. It looks like we're getting some errors here, so let's take a look at our low here. It looks like the cage might be a little bit too large. We also have the hood in here, which we don't want, so I'm just going to pull that out. I'll take a look at the cage again. That actually looks correct, so let's go ahead and bake again. I think it was just the hood causing issues. And I'll turn the high poly back off. Yeah, there we go. That's looking great. And our interior portions here are looking pretty good. You can see there is going to be sort of a harsh line here where we're swapping between unique UVs and this mirrored UV. Hopefully we won't see that with the character there, but you might want to include a little bit more of this region. Let's go ahead and do that real quick. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is cut out, see, maybe this region here. That looks pretty good. And I need to include this and this. Cut those here. And flip them. And give them their own sort of unique UV space. We could sew them into this front portion here. Yeah, that kind of works. Go ahead and do that instead of having sort of an unnecessary seam there. We are going to have to move these over to get a little bit more room. Perfect. Slide that over. And that right there. All right, now let's go ahead and re-export. Go back to tool bag. You can see this area now is unmapped because we moved it to an unmapped region. We can bake again. And now we're not getting this hard line here. We are getting it here. But once the character is in there, that's really not going to be a problem at all. So you might be thinking that this is kind of a lot of faces that really aren't going to be rendered very often. Now, what you can do is go ahead and remove basically a huge chunk of this that you're not going to see. Havoc Sims don't move very far. So if you were to take this interior portion, essentially cut out this area here, we could in theory remove this entire region, and that's probably going to work out just fine once we have a character in there, especially if we have kind of a t-shirt in there. We're already not seeing that, which is great. We're not seeing that hole that we just made. And if we have a character in there as well, the body is really going to block that. We might get some lift here, but not enough that we're going to see that hole. And same thing for like a shirt that would be underneath of this jacket. We don't need the entire shirt necessarily. So we could go in and just like start carving out a section here, making sure that it is actually nicely gridded, but just a huge section here that we could probably cut out so that it's not going to interpenetrate through this as it's animating. As you can see, it kind of already is here. We don't need to have all those faces. It's just kind of unnecessary. And it might even be unnecessary faces inside of our texture set as well. But if you know that the character is going to take the jacket off, it's a good idea to have the rest of the shirt just in case you need it at some point. All right, with that, now we have thickness. We have good looking EVs. This asset is ready to texture. Welcome to week 7 of cloth creation and simulation for real-time. This week we'll cover retopology for complex garments like quilting and ruffles, how to use trim sheets to create highly detailed zippers, buttons, straps, and buckles that are resolution independent of your garment textures, and how to get our scene set up and mesh maps baked in Substance Painter. This week you'll get some insight into when to sculpt and when not to sculpt, and how to set yourself up for success by making sure your render scene is ready before texturing. Let's get started. If you have quilted geometry in your piece, you might be wondering, how am I going to create stitching between each of these quilts? Now, the answer is that you may not necessarily have to. If you like the way it looks without stitching, you don't need to add it, but it could be a really cool addition. The best way to do this is to start with perfectly quadded topology, carve in your quilts, and then carve in geometry for your stitching to match. I'll go ahead and speed up the video here while I retopologize this section of cloth. You can see I've carefully laid out my topology here so that I have a vertex at each of the points that are in the center of a quilt and where one quilt connects to another. That's starting to look pretty good. Now I'll go ahead and go in with multi-cut and start carving in some geometry for my stitches. I'm not worrying about n-gons right now, I'm just worrying about placement. I'm only placing one line because I'm planning to bevel once I've placed all of my cuts for my stitching. What I am doing is making sure that each of these segments terminates at the crossing points I've already created in my geometry. Now let's go ahead and do the other direction. Alright, now we have geometry that matches not only with the quilts themselves, but the seam lines as well. So we're going to go ahead and select every edge, deselect the border edge, and then deselect the center edges of all of these quilts so that we just have the crossing patterns. Obviously, if you have a lot of quilting going on and a much larger piece, this is going to be a lot more complicated, so just take deep breaths and be patient. You will get there. Okay, so next, you can go ahead, and I'm just going to zoom in here and bevel these edges. I want to go decently large, but not too large. If you want to, you can add an additional segment that will run down the center. This is not necessary, depending on how deep the crevice between the quilts is. I'll just go ahead and do something like that. And then I will go to Mesh and Conform, just to make sure that those newly created edges are sitting right on the surface. So now if we go ahead and soften our normals, and I'll unlock them. And let's set this to a blend so we can see the detail here. So already we are starting to get a quilted look out of the base normals, which is great. It seems unfortunately I messed up a selection here, but this is easy to fix. There we go. Okay. So now we can go through and add stitching to all of these sections. And you may be wondering where they cross, what should you do? The best thing to do is to go ahead and actually add a center point to each of these and create an X here. And then on each of these edges, create a UV seam. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Here I have my low poly geometry with floating stitches. You can see here that the stitches are all kind of stacked on top of each other, and they have a UV seam at each of the crossing points. This enables me to go in and control exactly how these stitches will intersect. I can move this up to a new region and then slide these around a little just to make sure that we're not seeing half of a stitch. And we're only seeing full stitches. You'll need to do this for each intersection, which can get kind of annoying. But eventually, once you're done, if we go ahead and turn on our stitching, it's going to look pretty good. You can see I didn't go through here and fix the intersection at every point, but it's looking pretty good. And we can increase the threshold to get smaller stitches if we want to. Or increase the tile U to get more stitching. That looks pretty good. Another piece of geometry that might be a bit confusing on how to retopologize is lace cravats or any sort of hanging ruffle. Now, in most cases, you have to ask yourself if you actually are going to need to make a high poly at all. In the case of this particular ruffle, the answer is no. Especially if we take a look at this, you can see there's a lot of overlapping pipe folds, and trying to bake this is just going to be a nightmare. Of course, if we really wanted to, we could chop this up into separate pieces and bake them by name or in different groups if you're using Toolbag. However, if we go ahead and look at this remeshed from Marvelous Designer, the lighting is almost identical. In fact, it's actually better because it's not triangulated like this piece. So everything's quite smooth. Topology-wise, it's fairly low for this. It's a little bit higher than I'd like, but it's not too bad, around 5,000 triangles. I have loops that flow with the pipe folds to make sure that it maintains its silhouette. There's probably some triangles I don't need in here, but that's all right for this portfolio piece. I'll go ahead and keep it. So what is the reason that we don't really need a high res here? Well, since the lighting is identical on the low poly and the high res, baking a normal map would be a bit of a waste of time. If we want to add additional sculptural details, of course we can do that, and we can attempt to bake it down, but it might be easier just to add those details in Substance Painter. Here you can see my Painter file, in which I've gone ahead and added a few stacks of lace, which I will turn off here, as well as some memory folds. Memory folds are just on the height channel, and I can toggle them on and off. The lace here has a few different settings. First, we have some ambient occlusion, a blending mask for where I want my tiling normals to appear. Black will remove the tiling normals while white will show them. And an opacity mask, where white is opaque and black is transparent. These lace textures are from Milad Kambari, and you can find his profile on ArtStation. I highly recommend all of his tiling textures, they're fantastic. So let's take a look at how this is set up in Marmoset Toolbag for the final render. Here you can see I'm using Dithered Alpha with the opacity from the alpha channel of the albedo. I have my ambient occlusion piped in, and I have a tiling normal map that appears in these opaque areas to show that it really is fabric. I'm also using volumetric scattering to add a little bit of bounce lighting from behind. And so anything that's behind this is going to render through it, as you can kind of see with this environment map that we have here. I've also duplicated the mesh a number of times so that it stacks to create the illusion of height, which you can kind of see here. Up close, the illusion kind of breaks, but at a distance, it looks like it has a bit of thickness. I've also gone ahead and made sure that cull back faces is turned off so that when we spin around to the back side of the model, we can still see those. Looks pretty good, and I didn't have to worry about retopologizing my high poly. Now, if you really want to retopologize it, if you're worried about how dense it's getting, if this is for a background character, you can do that. What I highly recommend is that on your high poly, you make a lot of these folds not overlap quite as much so that it is easier to go through and sort of weld them and bake them down into one object. The first method for creating zippers is fairly simple. We want to add it to our high poly, so we'll go ahead and use something like an insert mesh brush. ZBrush comes with a few that work fairly well. There's a metal and a plastic version. I'm going to go ahead and use the metal version for this one. Next, I'm going to duplicate the panel that I want to place the zipper on. In this case, I want it to be on this panel, so I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate the entire subtool, solo this panel, drop down a couple of subdivisions, making sure that it's still maintaining its silhouette. Delete the lower and higher subdivisions, and then use ZModeler to go ahead and add a creased edge right here where I want that zipper to exist. So I'll hold the spacebar over an edge and select crease and edge loop partial. Then I'll go ahead and click on that edge. Next, I'll go ahead and select my insert mesh brush. Here I have a couple of different options. Since this is open, I'm going to use this semi-open, and I want the openings to be on the left side, so I'll use this one. We can drag out on the surface to see what the size is of this. And I'm going to go ahead and delete hidden as well, because I don't need those additional panels. That size looks about right. It might go a little bit larger. It's a good idea to turn on dynamic brush when you're working with this, so that as you're zooming in and out, the brush size remains the same and the size of the zipper remains the same. Next, I'll go up to Stroke. Under Curve Functions, deselect Border and Polygroups and make sure Creased Edges is selected and press Frame Mesh. This will add a curve right onto that creased edge. Then we can go ahead and click it, and we have our zipper. Pretty simple. Then I'll go ahead, remove that panel, delete hidden, and we're good to go. We can export this along with our high poly mesh, and if we turn this back on, we can go ahead and go to Stroke and delete. Of course, you can make any adjustments to the curve if you need to, if it's kind of penetrating through a little bit. You can go through and just adjust it as you need to, and then you can just bake that right down to your low poly. Let's take a look at what that looks like in Marmoset Toolbag. So here I have my high poly mesh in Marmoset Toolbag, and you can see that I have my zipper in here, and the base geometry. Now on the low poly, if I go ahead and turn off high poly here and turn on the low poly, turn off the normal map real quick. You can see I don't have any special geometry for this zipper. I do have a strip here that runs kind of vertically that does match fairly nicely. So it is good to have some supporting topology. I'm going to turn off the wireframe. So if we turn back on the high poly and we drop into this low group, we can see the cage and visualize it. And we just want to make sure that our zipper is within the boundaries of the cage. So you can adjust your max offset here. We just see how this begins to clip through. We want to make sure that that's not happening. So we'll push out just as far as we need to make sure it's not clipping through. Then we can go ahead and bake. Now, it will also be beneficial to bake an object ID map, which is going to give you a color based on what the object is. So for each separate object in the high poly, in this case we have the puffer jacket and the zipper, we're going to get a different color. So I've gone ahead and baked some maps already for this. So I'll go ahead and turn them on. And you can see that that zipper is baked, though it is fairly low res. And in the albedo map, here I've placed that object ID, and we can see the zipper is nice and bright blue. Now, if you're going to use this method, I recommend making sure that your zipper is a little bit on the larger side. As you can see here, a fairly realistic size zipper does not bake down well. This is a 4K texture, which is probably not what you're going to be given for a puffer jacket like this. Budget-wise, unfortunately, this method, though it's fairly simple, doesn't really get us the resolution that we want for a nice zipper, and it is baked down flat. Now you could add some geometry to this to give it some thickness, but there is an easier way. We're going to go ahead and use a trim mesh. The zipper trim material for the course comes with a few different things. First, we have the pull tab and the area where the zipper kind of connects in. We'll want to place these strategically to kind of hide the ends of these zippers so that they don't look like they just terminate into space, as you can see here. Now, on the zipper side, we have two options. We have an open here that has alpha, and we have a closed that has them zipped together. If we look at the wireframe here, you can see that it's very simply just baked down to a plane. And if we look at the textures, you can see that we have the closed, open, and the bottom here we have some space for the pull tabs. So let's go ahead and apply this now to our puffer jacket so we can see what it looks like in a real life example. In my scene here, I've gone ahead and imported the zipper FBX file that has the pull tabs and the example geometry. I'm going to go ahead and start by setting up the material. In the attribute editor, we'll go to the zipper trim material. For the color, I'll go ahead and load the C map. Then I'm going to copy this path, and then for the bump mapping, select File, Tangent Space Normals instead of Bump, and then paste in and change the C to an N for the normal map. It'll look a little strange to begin with. We'll change the color space from sRGB to raw, and now this should look roughly correct. The transparency should have come in automatically as it is the alpha channel of the color map, so we should have some transparency going on here for the open side. As you can see, we do. Now, if you notice that your transparency looks a little bit strange, you're going to want to change your transparency algorithm from the default object sorting, which would look like this, to alpha cut. If you don't have alpha cut in the version of Maya you're using, you can also use depth peeling. That should work as well, and you might need to adjust your transparency quality to change the sort of performance impact of that. I'll change it back to alpha cut and close. Now, if you want this to be even closer to how it will be rendered, you can go ahead and actually break the connection with the color and set it to a relatively dark gray. Then for the specular color, we're going to go ahead and select a file. Then we want the color texture. And we can drop this gray even lower. And now this should match fairly well. It's a little bit hard to see, so not sure if I recommend this. You can kind of bump up the color a little bit if you need to, or adjust the ambient color if it's too dark for you. But that should be fairly close. Cosine power we can increase if we want it to be glossier, but I think where it comes in by default is pretty good, as this is a Phong shader. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove the example geometry because we don't need it. And then I'm going to go ahead and center the pivot on all of these. And then I'm going to go ahead and group the pull tab together, center the pivot. That's pretty good. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is select my geometry where I want the zippers to kind of be on top of. Then control click my pull tab group here. And go to constrain normal. I want the aim vector to be 0 on X, 0 on Y, and 1 on Z. And then I want the up vector to be 1 on Y. And I'll go ahead and hit apply. Next, I'm going to do the exact same thing for the end piece. This will rotate them a bit strangely, but I'll show you what's actually happening here. If we go ahead and move this up, the normals of the jacket here are constraining the transforms and rotation of the zipper. So no matter where we move it, it is aiming nicely back at our geometry here. So we can kind of place this where we want it to be. And I'm going to go for something sort of down here, as we'll want this to kind of be, in most cases, it's hidden a little bit behind a zipper stand on the clothing. So let's say that it's roughly here. I'm going to take the end and do the same. Now, usually for the zipper stand on the other side, it'll actually be on top. So we can go ahead and just push this through. And it's going to go ahead and flip around for us. Now, the one thing you can't really do after you've made that change is rotate it. Now, you can rotate it once, but as soon as you move it, it's going to constrain it again and adjust that rotation. So once you're happy with the placement, you can go ahead and in the outliner, just delete the constraint. I'm going to keep it on for now. So next, let's go ahead and create the actual zipper geometry. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate my jacket and pull it out of my hierarchy and hide the original. Then I'm going to go ahead and grab the edge where I want this zipper to exist. I'm going to go ahead and delete everything that I don't want a zipper to be on. I'll press Ctrl-Shift-I to invert my selection and delete. There we go. So next I'm going to go ahead and select that edge and this other edge that I want it to sit on top of. Now I already have topology here that I could use. This is about the right size. If you don't have that, what you can do is you can just go ahead and extrude from here. Kind of adjust the placement a little bit. And get something that has consistent width. That's important. This one's kind of doing some weird stuff. So you may want to extrude them separately. I have different settings. In this case, because I already have geometry that's going to work pretty well, I'm just going to go ahead and select it. And invert my selection. and remove the faces I don't need. Go ahead and turn back on my original low. And we can go ahead and going to want to push these out a little bit. So I will hold with the move tool, I will hold control and middle mouse drag to push out along the normals. That's pretty good. Next, we want to embed very slightly the side that is not open, the side that doesn't have alpha. So we will go ahead and do the opposite here, just sort of a little bit closer, not fully embedded. On this side, we're looking okay. And it's important to go through and just make sure that the thickness of this strip of polygons is relatively consistent. And then we're going to have it stop right where this end piece is. We can go ahead and sort of hide it inside the end piece. I'll even scale the end piece a little bit bigger to kind of hide it in there, to give us kind of the illusion that this is ending here. Realistically, it should probably actually be hanging off the bottom. So before I deleted that, let's go ahead, bring this down here, and increase that size a little bit, push it in so it's kind of clipping through just slightly. I'm going to go ahead and delete that constraint now that I'm placing this exactly where I want it. Make sure that the thickness is consistent. Okay, that looks pretty good. It's a little bit large, but I think it looks pretty good from here. I'm just kind of estimating how this is going to look when it's fully textured. Size-wise, I think that's not bad. Of course, if you want to swap these, I probably would have the end on the other side and the larger zipper here because it's going to be more visible. So that might be a good idea. I'll just go ahead and increase the size of this as well. Bring it around here. And move it down slightly. As you can see, as I move it down, it starts to wrap around the underside here. So be cognizant of that. You may need to remove your constraint. I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And you'll want to make sure that constraint is on the group so that you don't have to make an individual one per model here since they're separate models. Increase the size and remove some portions of this that I don't need. There are some good scripts out there for making sure that edge lengths are consistent. So it may be worth looking into something like that. This is pretty good for now. I'm actually going to take in a few key locations. I'm going to go ahead and push the geometry out a little bit further. Say down to here. And just kind of rotate it out a little bit so it's a little bit more camera facing. Yep. Now let's go ahead and UV this. So I'll go ahead and apply our zipper trim material. In this case, it's zipper 1 because I already had the zipper in the scene. And we'll go ahead and make sure that the image is visible. There we go. And I like to dim it just so that it's not so blaringly bright. Go ahead and increase the size of this. Luckily, I already have this UV'd fairly straight up and down, which is good. We can use straighten here to get even straighter piece. Do the same on this side. flip these back faces, and then go ahead and sew these together. Straighten again. Okay. So now we're just going to scale this up until we have, and let's go ahead and look at the normal map because it might be easier to understand. We've got a little bit of cloth here where it's sewn in, which is nice. And then we have our zipper here where it is alphaed out. The alpha is actually a little bit closer than the normal map shows here. The normal map has a little bit of dilation here so that the edge of the geometry doesn't just immediately change to flat normal. It has a bit of a fall off in the texture. So let's go ahead and see what that's looking like. That's pretty good. We have to think about size-wise if we're happy with it, and there's a little bit of a downward slope here in the geometry. So we will need to fix that. You can use edge slide to sort of move some stuff up. That can be incredibly helpful to make sure that there isn't too much of a curve to this. You can also unfold your UVs and let them be a little bit more relaxed if you'd like. That is another way to solve this problem. But this is looking fairly good. We just needed to judge if we are happy with the size. And I think I am. I think it's looking pretty good. We can also adjust the sort of, we can scale this more or less. And it is going to warp a little bit, but if you notice that they're a little bit too skinny, you can scale this and make it a little bit smaller on the U direction. Otherwise, I think it's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and scale up the other side to match. Now we'll want to check what's happening here. Because this is on the other side, we need to go ahead and rotate our UVs around. And there we go. We'll just keep getting a little bit larger. Now, it's important with stuff like this that you check with your engineers, depending on what engine you're using, there may be something called UV compression. The engine is going to attempt to compress all of the data outside of 0 to 1 space, and as you can see, these extend fairly far outside of that. What this could result in is potentially some unforeseen errors in textures and UVs on the rest of your mesh. If you're noticing that, strategically go through and cut parts of this mesh up and stack them on top of each other instead of having them extend so far outside of the 0 to 1 space. I believe Unreal has the option to turn this off. That's another option. Marmoset Toolbag is not going to have any problems with this at all. So we're pretty good. Now we want to make sure that the size is relatively the same. Luckily the face sizes were fairly close here, but we may need to scale this a little bit differently. Okay. So one of the major flaws that you may have noticed about this already is that it doesn't have any thickness, right? As soon as you turn to the side, it's gone. Now we can turn on double-sided rendering in Marmoset Toolbag, and that's going to help us. But it's not going to entirely fix the problem, right? We're still not going to have any thickness. There's a couple of ways that we can deal with that. First is to go ahead and extrude it. And I'll go ahead and set the local translate Z to something like -0.1, something like in that range. And I'll go ahead and reverse that. So now we have visible geometry on both sides. However, down this center path, we still don't have anything visible, right? So what we can do about that is go ahead and cut this out into its own island, okay? And this doesn't appear to have, oh, right. We can go ahead and delete faces on the side that is embedded. We don't need those. And we also don't need the faces on the top or bottom. So we can go ahead and remove those. Okay, so for these faces, I will go ahead and move them up slightly. And I'll grab one edge, convert it to UVs, and I'll deselect down here. And I'm just going to pull this out a little bit. We can take a look at the checker here to see how it's matching up. That looks pretty good. Let's turn off our checker now. And I'll go ahead and move this back down into the same space as its original. And what we're going to need to do is sort of adjust these down so that we're getting a little bit of warping here on the back, but oh yeah, that warping is horrible. We'll need to adjust this so that rather than the alpha being visible around the entirety of this prong of the zipper, that it comes very close to the edge, something like this. Then we will take this center edge and line it up. We can go ahead and shrink it so it is practically flat. And then line it up right with the widest point of the prong. And then we do get the sort of illusion of some thickness here, as you can see. Still not ideal. We're not getting anything in here. So let's talk about the last sort of way to get some thickness. Probably my favorite way to get some thickness. Now first, let's go ahead and fix some of the UV issues that we're seeing, some of the warping. Remove that extrusion. Let's take a look at these faces where we're warping. Let's see what's going on there. Just go ahead and optimize that and straighten it out. You don't have to have perfectly straight UVs. It's not always necessary, but it does help, I will say. We can go ahead and move this back out a little bit. All right, that's looking better. Great, okay. So the next way to add thickness is to simply duplicate this geometry, grab all of the faces, and then scale it along the normals. And then we're going to do the same thing. Do it again. And you'll want to do this between 3 and 5 times. And what this is going to do is from a distance, it's going to look like this has thickness. Now there's going to be a little bit of aliasing because of the viewport quality, but you can already see it's starting to have the illusion of thickness. Let's go ahead and duplicate this again. Oh, sorry, forgot to duplicate. Push it out this time a little bit. And one more time. Okay. So now at a distance, we're starting to get what appears to be some thickness. And it is visible on every part of this. Now we're not seeing back faces in the Maya viewport because I have them turned off. We can turn on shading, we can turn off backface culling. In later versions of Maya, for some reason, it actually shows you like a normal error, basically. It just is black, which is kind of annoying, to be honest. It used to be that it would show it just fully lit and textured. This is so it differentiates itself a little bit from the front faces, but alas. So let's go ahead and get this into Toolbag and see what it looks like with textures on. Here we are in Toolbag, and I've gone ahead and just added a couple of different textures to my puffer jacket here. We have a baked normal map. We have a tiling normal map. And I've gone ahead and set the detail weight to about 60%. I'm going to double the tile here. Maybe I'll increase the weight. Anyway, and it's set to anisotropic shading, just like we did in week 2. Now we have our zipper here. The first thing I'm going to do is select my puffer jacket low here, and on the individual meshes, I'm going to turn off cull back faces. Now this isn't necessary for the hood as it is entirely encapsulated. Zipper will go ahead and turn off cull back faces. So now we can see the back face of our zipper meshes. So now let's go ahead and set up our zipper shader. I'm going to select this zipper trim shader that was pulled in with the FBX. Let's go into our textures, zippers, and we'll choose the normal map. It's just going to look odd until we turn on our alpha. We'll grab our albedo. For the roughness, I'll go ahead and select this G for gloss, and that should be in the red channel. For metalness, we'll go ahead and select the same texture and set the channel to G. Now we can see the metalness coming through, and the roughness, beautiful. Next, we'll go ahead and add our occlusion. This is going to be inside of our M map here in the blue channel. We can go ahead and preview this here. We can see what the different textures are. So there's nothing in alpha. Blue channel has ambient occlusion. Green channel here has light transmittance. If you want to go ahead and apply that to the cloth on here, you can do that. And the red channel has a mask here for tiling normal map if you wanted to apply tiling normal map onto the fabric. Next, we'll go ahead and under transparency, we will add cutout. It'll automatically use the alpha channel of our albedo here. So we can uncheck that if we want to, if we wanted to use a custom one. This works pretty well. And you can see it gives the illusion of thickness on these zippers, and they light fairly well. Size-wise, they're looking pretty good. Resolution, they're very crisp. We have our pull tab down here. It's looking correct. And our end piece here. Overall, leaves a very nice look. Now, the substance file for the zipper is included. If you would like to change the color, change it from metal to plastic, anything like that, please feel free to do so. You have the FBX, you have the Substance Painter file. Do whatever you need to do for your garment. If you notice that you're seeing some stretching like I'm seeing here, go back and modify your geometry. And now this asset is ready for texturing. Here I have my hunter in his texturing scene in Substance Painter. You can see at the root of my scene here, I have a handful of miscellaneous objects. If we go ahead and zoom in, you can see that I have a couple of metal fasteners, a button and a buttonhole, a belt buckle, a tiling leather belt, and 2 different fabric cords, one used for rope and one used for the ties on the hood and the gloves. I've instanced all of these around the character, including buttons on the front here, belt buckle, ties on the gloves, and the buckle here for the cuff, this rope here, and the leather fastener that's sort of holding it in place onto the belt, and these smaller leather same texture space as these here in the origin. If we go ahead and look at the texture sheet, you can see that I have the leather belt laid out so that it tiles horizontally, as well as the 2 cords, and there are 2 separate end pieces for the belts in case I need them. The rest is laid out in the additional space I had remaining. The benefit of creating a trim sheet like this is to be able to have a lot of detail in smaller pieces that are not resolution dependent upon your base texture set. For instance, if the buttons were baked down into this jacket here, and I needed to reduce the resolution of the jacket in order to improve performance, I would lose a lot of resolution in these buttons as well because they're fairly small. However, with them separate, I can go ahead and drop the resolution on the base jacket and then adjust the resolution on these buttons to make sure that they're not losing too much detail. I'm mostly using these for things that don't have a lot of complicated shapes. Ropes are fairly simple, just cylinders, same thing with ties. They don't need specifically made individual high poly meshes in the scene. I only need to create one high poly mesh and then bake that down to a low poly and instance it across the mesh, or create a trim sheet as I did for the rope here and these ties. This saves me a lot of time making my high poly and my low poly. I don't have to worry about my low poly scene matching up perfectly with my high poly scene with individually created buttons and fasteners and buckles and straps. All of them can be derived from the same space. So let's take a look at how this was made. Here in my Maya scene, you can see I have the high poly assets for my trim sheets. They're all made using Maya subdivision and lofted curves. I've set individual Lambert materials onto them to specify the type of material that they're made of in my ID map so that when I go ahead and start texturing, I can specify that red is nickel and green is plastic and so forth. If we go ahead and take a look at the low poly here, these match up perfectly, but then I also have my instance geometry around the scene. If we look at the UVs, in 0 to 1, I only have these low poly meshes that are baking from the source high poly data. All of my instances have been moved outside of 0 to 1 space because I don't need to texture directly on them and I don't want them to affect any of the bakes. Most bakers will ignore anything outside of 0 to 1 space unless you're using UDIMs. You can see that the belt is snapped to the end of the region, as well as these two chords. You can also see that these chords do not have a high poly mesh. That's because in most cases, trying to bake one cylinder down to another cylinder is going to give you an identical result and you'll just get a flat normal map. It's really not going to look any different, so it's not really worth doing. For the buttonhole, I've gone ahead and made a floater mesh that fakes an inset created by a buttonhole, sort of the hole itself, as well as the fibers around it. That way when I bake, I'm going to get something like this, where we can see the fibers of the buttonhole and the actual hole itself, and when it's placed on the character, we actually get a little bit of an inset there. The fibers on the button itself are baked down flat, which in some cases may cause a skew to occur, and if you're looking at it at a really glancing angle, it is going to look flat, but it works fairly well at a distance. Now, once I have these made, you might be wondering how I would make a belt from this trim or some laces or a rope and place it into that UV space. So one of the easiest ways to do this is to use Maya 2022's new sweep mesh. If I go ahead and create a curve, just using the EP curve tool, I can go up to Create Sweep Mesh. By default, this gives me something akin to a tube, and I can control the number of sides it has, and the scale profile, the precision amount, which will increase the number of spans horizontally, and it increased the resolution of the curve. And we can also optimize that so that we're only getting spans where we need them. You can also change this to a rectangle, which is ready for subdivision, not something we would typically use. Or we can set a custom profile. This will open up a custom sweep profile menu. From here, I can change the type from curve object to poly edge, and then select this edge of my belt and click OK. Now you can see I have topology that matches my low poly belt perfectly. I can rotate the profile 90 degrees and get a nice flat belt, and I can adjust the scale back to 1 to match exactly with my source. I can also optimize and adjust the precision as I need it, taper it if I wanted to. In some cases you may want to do this with a rope. And then we'll want to look at the UV section down here. For create UVs, I like to set it to unfold. What this is going to do is unwrap this so that it is uniformly unwrapped. And you can see we get pretty clean UVs here, not a lot of stretch going on. Straight up and down, just like our tiling texture. The only difference is we have a different UV seam, which I can go ahead and change simply by cutting this here and sewing there. Now, on my trim sheet here, I have decided that I only have the front unwrapped and the back is a clone of the front. So I can grab the back side of this and flip it along the U direction and then lay it over the top perfectly. Then rotate it to match. And typically what I'll do is I will select the piece that I'm UVing and the source low poly piece. And then scale it to fit. It doesn't need to match up perfectly because we're not really baking it, but getting as close as possible is good. Then I will move it outside of 0 to 1 space by using the arrow keys, which you can set the amount that moves under transform here in the move palette. If you change this number, it will adjust how far you move this with the arrow keys. And there we have a belt. Now I can grab one of the ends and duplicate it. Set my pivot to one of the matching vertices, and then rotate it into place. And I can weld those, and I'm off to the races. For these other meshes, since they're so unique, all we do is simply duplicate them, rotate them, and scale them to move them around in the scene. Hopefully this gets you thinking about some cool ways that you can use trims and repetitive meshes in your scene. A utility trim sheet like this works very well for a portfolio piece. However, in a studio environment, you may want to have some specific trims or kits for all of your characters to share. You could create a kit of different straps, buttons, buttonholes, stitches, ropes, buckles, and fasteners, and share them across all of your characters. That way you can start developing a library to build out your characters faster. If you don't have access to Maya 2022, I recommend a plugin called QuickPipe by Adnan Chaumet. Apologies if I got your name wrong there, but this is an awesome tool. I'll go ahead and select the curve I just made and hit the quick pipe button, and I get a pipe, hence the name. We can go ahead and set the uniform topology here to 0 to get uniform divisions. And now we can control the number of divisions along the curve. We can adjust the ramp scale. We can adjust the shape twist to create braiding if we want to, the number of height segments, and so forth. This works really well. This plugin is free, you can find it on Gumroad, and I'll link it in the course resources. Another option is to simply use Maya's built-in tools. If you create a NURBS circle at the root point of a NURBS curve, you can go to Surfaces, Extrude, and under the options, you can choose Polygons. I usually set the type to quads, tessellation method to count, and set the count to something around 300 to start, and take a look at how that comes out. Clearly not perfect, it doesn't match up with the curve, and unfortunately it's not live with the curve either. If you have access to 2022, I highly recommend using the sweep tool, and if you can't use that, try QuickPipe. Before we start texturing, we need to bake our mesh maps, and in order to do so, we want to make sure that we have a good naming convention. You can see here all of my low poly meshes have the suffix low after an underscore. If we jump over to ZBrush, all of my high poly meshes have the suffix high. If you have any meshes that you want to bake but keep separate, you can add an additional underscore, and everything after that underscore will be ignored during the baking process. So glove outer high extension will bake with glove outer high. With that done, I'll go ahead and decimate my mesh at about 20% decimation, which does a pretty good job of making sure that there's no faceting, but also greatly reduces the number of triangles. You can see here I'm at 5.9 million, and originally it was somewhere around 30 million. I can export this as an FBX, and I like to make sure that I export my polygroups as materials so that when I bake an ID mask, I'm going to get a different color for each polygroup. Now let's get our scene set up in Substance Painter. To get started with Painter this week, let's go ahead and grab the resources provided for week 7. They include a template and an export preset. If you navigate to Documents, Adobe, Substance Painter, and then Assets, you'll find the assets that you've imported to Painter since you've started working with it, unless you use a custom shelf. I'll go ahead and add a new folder called Templates, and then drag and drop my CGMA cloth SPT file into the Templates folder. Then I'll go ahead and, under Export Presets, add my Marmoset Toolbag export preset. Great. Now back in Painter, I'll go to File, New, and set my template to the CGMA cloth template that we just added. Then I'll go ahead and grab my Hunter Low FBX. Make sure the document resolution is something I'm happy with. 2K should be just fine for the number of materials I have. If I wanted to get a little more detail, I could go with 4096, but that's what I'm hoping most of my tiling textures will make up for. And with all of the rest at default settings, I'll go ahead and click OK. So let's take a look at what we get out of this template. So the first thing you'll notice is that shadows are enabled. So we can kind of get a sense of lighting that is stronger than the default, which is to have the shadows disabled. If we go under the display settings here, we can turn them off and see what that looks like. It really does make a big difference. Now I've set the computation mode to lightweight and dropped the opacity quite a bit. If your computer is having trouble with this, you can just go ahead and turn them off. I also set the environment map to Studio Tomiko, which I believe to be one of the more neutral lighting setups, but feel free to set the environment map to whatever you're comfortable with. I've also enabled a LUT here, the ACES standard log. This matches the ACES LUT that we were using in Marmoset Toolbag in week 2 for our rendering. This will help us to better color match between the two softwares. In the shader settings, I've gone ahead and left it as the Adobe Standard Material Metal Rough, but if you want opacity, you can use the PBR Metal Rough with alpha blending or alpha cutout, your choice. You can also use Spec Gloss if you prefer, though the export preset will be largely useless to you in that case. I've disabled all of the special parameters except for displacement and tessellation. I recommend actually disabling the displacement. Right now the scale is at 0 anyway, so you shouldn't see any difference, but you might as well just disable it because we're not going to use it. Now in the channels box for our texture set settings, you'll notice that we also have a couple of additional textures more than what the standard shader gives us. We have ambient occlusion added so that we can modify it in our layer stack. We have a blending mask so that we can blend between our tiling information and our base information. And we have a translucency channel so that we can export this and modify it as we need to in the layer stack and use that for any volumetric scattering we might use. So now that we understand how the scene is set up, we can go ahead and start baking our mesh maps. I'll scroll down to the mesh map section and click bake. And then I'm just going to uncheck all of these for now. Then I'll grab my high poly mesh and the high definition meshes, which I've called Hunter High here. And then I will go into the selection set up here. And for now, I'm just going to bake the Hunter collar. So I'll go back to my common settings, and I want to change the output size to at least the document resolution. So I'll set that to 2K. Make sure my anti-aliasing is set to 8x8. Set the match to by mesh name, which is going to use these suffixes to find the high and low poly, which we conveniently set up in both of our FBX files. Then I'll go ahead and check normal, and let's just do the normal map for now. I'll bake this texture. Not bad. There's a couple little errors in here where things are kind of folding over, but it's not super noticeable, so I'm not too concerned about it. It's lighting nicely. I can see some of the memory folds that I sculpted into here. It's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and bake the rest of the maps for this texture set. I'm going to skip ID, ambient occlusion, position, and curvature for now while I have the anti-aliasing set to 8x8, and just do the world space normal since I've already baked the base normal. Go ahead and bake that. Fantastic. It's really just a conversion, so it should be pretty fast. Then I'm going to disable the anti-aliasing, set it to none, because if we were to have anti-aliasing set for ID and ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and thickness, it would really just be a waste. There shouldn't be a ton of detail in any of these except for the curvature. Adding the anti-aliasing to the curvature doesn't really seem to help much. If you are noticing some strange bake errors that you're not seeing in any other maps in your curvature, be sure to set this self-intersection to only by mesh name, and then hit apply to all here so that it does it for all of the textures. We're going to do the same thing for ambient occlusion and set self-occlusion to only same mesh name, and ignore backface. I'm going to set this to never. But if you are noticing some bake errors from backfaces, you can set this to by mesh name or always. I'll go ahead and hit apply to all again. And then under thickness, we're going to do the same thing, self-occlusion, only same mesh name, and then apply to all. So now we can go ahead and bake these. Great. So now we have all of our mesh maps baked here. And if we look under the shader, there's actually an ambient occlusion intensity slider that we can adjust the intensity in the shader. Now, the nice part about having the ambient occlusion in the layer stack is that you can actually see it update in real time. Pretty nice. All right, so let's go ahead and set up our initial textures for this character. I'm going to add a fill layer, call it base layer, and then put it in a group and call that master base layer. I'm going to go ahead and instantiate this across all of my texture sets and hit OK. What this is going to do is it's going to duplicate everything that's inside of this group across all of my texture sets, so that if I change this base color, you can see it updates across the entire character. I like to set a base layer on every texture set before I get started that drops the color to a lower mid-gray, increases the roughness a little bit, adds whatever baked ambient occlusion information, and thickness, and then instantiates that across all of these textures so that I don't have to go into each individual texture set and set up a base layer on every single one. Now, usually I'll set this up on a material that seems to have a lot of different types of materials in it. So something that has cloth and leather and plastic, whatever. Unfortunately, I don't have a texture like that in here because I've split this up mostly by material type. So instead, I would typically put this in whatever the largest texture area is, or the most prominent. In this case, I would probably put it on the upper coat material here, but this works for now. So the next thing I'm going to do immediately now that I've set this up, let's imagine that I've baked textures for all of my separate materials. I'm going to go ahead and export. I can go to File, Export Textures, or press Ctrl-Shift-E to bring up the Texture Export dialog. Here I'm going to change the output template to the Marmoset Toolbag one that I've created for you guys, which if we go ahead and look at the output templates, we can dissect this a little bit and see what it is. So the first thing to note is that it's going to take the name of the texture set, and in this case we have Hunter Collar, and then add an extension. So for color we have C, for roughness or glossiness we have G, for utility or miscellaneous map we have M, and then for our normal map we have N. So in the color channel we have our base color and opacity in the alpha. You would have to add opacity manually, which I will show you in a moment, to be able to export it. In our gloss map, we have roughness in the red channel, metallic in the green channel, and emissive in the blue channel. Once again, you would have to add emissive to your shader manually. In our miscellaneous map, we have a blending mask for our tiling normals and tiling albedo in the red channel, a translucency map for volumetric scattering in the green channel, and our ambient occlusion in the blue channel. And then we have our normal map, which I've set to the normal OpenGL under the converted maps, just in case you've accidentally selected DirectX. This will convert it to OpenGL. So we can go ahead and select which textures we want to export. In this case, I want to export the color. And under our global settings, I will change this to Marmoset Toolbag. And let's put this in a folder that makes sense. 7, lecture content, textures, Hunter. Select that, and I will go ahead and export. If you want to add opacity or emissive under the channels section of the texture set settings, you can hit this little plus button, and then we get a list of different textures that we can add. So we can add emissive here, or if you want opacity, it's under unsupported by shader opacity. Next, let's go over into Toolbag and do our initial scene setup with our base textures. To install the custom albedo tiling shader that I've included in this week's resources, navigate to Program Files, Marmoset, Toolbag 4, Data, Shader, Matte, Custom, and drag and drop the detail albedo into this location. Then in any of our materials here, we can go down to, say, the coat upper here, go down to extra in the shader and add custom. And then we can add this detail albedo. And we can choose a tiling albedo map. So I'll use the fibers. And then we'll pick a channel. Right now, because we don't have a detail weight map, we can just choose red here. We can just turn this up to 1 and we'll start to see this tiling. And we'll want to set this value to whatever the value of our tiling normal map is to match. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to link them. I really wanted to be able to do that, but perhaps I will figure that out at some point. We also have an offset control that should match with your tiling normal map and a weight control for the intensity. Usually I will keep this fairly subtle. Now what this does is it is a multiply. So if you want this to be a full color texture, you can absolutely do that. What I'm using this for is to get a little bit of extra occlusion from the fibers. So if we go ahead and turn on the detail normals as well, go ahead and grab that same normal map, match. This is going to look a little bit odd because it's leather with this sort of fiber on it, but that doesn't look too bad actually. So we tiled that about 200 times, so I'll set the tiling to 200. And now we can see our normal map here, as well as our detail albedo here, which just helps to really push this. If we go ahead and zoom out a little bit, we kind of lose that detail a little, and we can get it back a little bit by adding in some of it to the albedo. So if you want to use that, you're welcome to. If you don't want to use it, that's fine too. Unfortunately, I believe this does not work with ray tracing. Oh, it does. It works with ray tracing. Fantastic. Thanks to Marmoset for updating that. So yeah, just a little bit of extra detail out of your detail maps. But feel free to use this for any sort of tiling information that you might want to include across your textures. It doesn't necessarily have to match up with tiling information, but that's what I'm using it for. In Toolbag, I've gone ahead and imported the same FBX that I'm using as my texture scene so that I have my low poly mesh in the scene. And I've set up a couple of lights and some basic camera settings, very similar to what we did in week 2. So let's go ahead and set up the shader on our collar here. I'll go ahead and navigate to the correct folder. And let's find my collar. And we want the normal map. Very nice. There's a bit of CPU denoising going on in this latest version of Toolbag. So that's what the sort of graininess is here. For albedo, I'll go ahead and grab the color map. For roughness, I will grab the G map and make sure it's set to the red channel. For metalness, I will grab the same texture and set it to the green channel. Then I'll go ahead and add occlusion. And select the blue channel. And then under extra, I'll select custom. And under shader, I'll select detail albedo frag. For now, I will leave that empty. Now I'm going to set the surface to detail normals and select my leather detail normal map. So I'll go to my resources folder, textures, fabric tile, and leather here. Set the tiling higher. 3 isn't bad. Just to start to see these textures with the detail normals. We want to be able to visualize that as early as possible. And I can already tell that I don't really like this detail map for this type of leather, so I know I'm going to have to make another one. Which is unfortunate, but sometimes that's the way this goes. It's not bad though. And then we can add our detail weight map. Which is back in here. We want hunter. We want that to be the red channel. Which for now is currently black, so we're actually going to lose that detail. And then we'll set the same thing for the albedo detail weight. And unfortunately, because the custom shaders don't really have this drop down available, you have to slide the detail channel red to 1. Of course, if you want to use a different one, you can use any of these. And you'll want to make sure that your detail tiling is set to the same number. And I'll go ahead and grab the detail albedo from my resources. Just this leather tile color map here. All right. Typically what I will do is I will set that up, then start my texturing process and export frequently to look at it in the sort of render target context. I'll usually have Toolbag open on one monitor and Painter open on the other so that I can get a clear picture of what my changes are doing and I can see them kind of update in real time. And since we've hooked all these textures up, we can go back into Painter, go to our collar here, and let's say paint something across the surface. Then we can go ahead and re-export the color map. Now when we come back here, we have that texture updated. So I can continue to work this way, going back and forth, updating my textures, seeing them in the scene, making modifications until I'm happy with the results. For homework this week, submit your final low poly topology as a Maya file or FBX. If you have time, get your initial mesh map bakes applied to your garments and render them in your toolbag scene. If you'd like additional feedback on your high poly assets or some ideas for trim sheets, please include them in your submission for this week. Happy baking! I'll talk a bit about posing your character and how to use Marvelous Designer for even better results.